Sorry, thank you. So as Cheryl said, this has just been an awful year that we're just ending. I think most of us, it's one of the worst years that we can remember in memory. So the idea here is to start us off with some good news, some reasons to be hopeful. And everything you're about to see comes from Steven Pinker's new book, Enlightenment Now. So I would, if you find it at all intriguing, I would highly recommend picking it up. So let's get into it. He starts the book with this concept of the optimism gap. And what he describes that as, when pollsters ask people about their own economic situation, if it was going to get better or worse in the coming year, most people say it's going to get better. But when they're asked about their country's economic situation, most of them say it's going to get worse. In other words, people think things are bad, even if that's contrary to their own personal experience. And he goes on to explain, another example of that is in almost every year from 1992 to 2015, in an era where the rate of violent crime really plummeted, a majority of Americans told pollsters that they thought crime was on the rise. In other words, people think things are worse than they are. So the question is why? Why do we think that? And he offers two answers. One is the globally available 24-hour news cycle. And most of us are familiar with the old adage in the news business: if it bleeds, it leads. All right. In other words, bad news makes headlines. Good news does not. When's the last time you heard a war did not break out today? Right? That doesn't happen. But if a war does break out, you're going to hear about that. And he says, you make a list of all of the worst things that are happening anywhere in the world, and that's the news for the day. And so therefore, you have a pretty impressive sounding case that civilization has really never faced greater peril. So that's one of his answers. The second answer is what behavioral economists call the availability heuristic. In other words, people estimate the probability of an event by the ease with which instances come to mind when they think about it. So you combine those two things, the more often our heads are filled with this bad news from all over the world. If we were to ask ourselves, how often do these things happen and how often are they likely to happen in the future? It doesn't matter how often they happen in the past. It's how easy can we bring to mind an example of that kind of a thing. And we think they're going to happen more often in the future. And so we see it happen. Bad things happen all the time, and we think things are getting worse. And that's just the way humans think, unfortunately. But are they really? Are things really getting worse? And he offers this evidence to the contrary. He says, in the year 2000, all 189 members of the United Nations agreed on 8 Millennium Development Goals for the year 2015 to make the world a better place. And here's the shocker. The world has made spectacular progress on every single measure of human well-being. And here's the second shocker. Almost nobody knows about it. But that's what I want to fix today. I want to share with you as many of these as I can, some good news on progress in the areas of life, health, food, wealth, inequality, environment, peace, safety, equal rights, knowledge, and happiness. And yes, I started out trying to pick 21, and I think I ended up with 25 or 30. So these are going to go by really fast. Don't blink or you're going to miss them. All right, we're going to start with life. Average life expectancy has doubled in the last 120 years. When my grandfather was born in the year 1901, average life expectancy all around the world was about 35 years. And that's mostly because so many children died before the age of 5. It just brought the average down. Today, that average is over 70 years. And in developed nations, it's over 80 years. In fact, it's growing. Life expectancy is growing so fast that every year you get 12 months older, but you only get 7 months closer to your expected date of death. All right. And an extreme example of that, in Kenya, between 2003 and 2013, life expectancy grew 10 years in that decade. So what that literally means is during that decade, the people in the country of Kenya got 10 years older, but on average, they got no closer to their date of death. They had just as much life left at the end of that decade as they did at the beginning, right? And again, a lot of this is because the child mortality rate has plummeted from around a third of all children back in the 1700s died before they had their 5th birthday to an almost immeasurably small number on this scale today. Or if you move forward to looking at food, famine deaths per 100,000 people back in the middle of the 1800s would be what you see on here: 400, 1,000, 1,500 people per 100,000 would die of starvation. Now it's almost zero, given the scale that this particular chart is drawn on. It's hard to even read what the number is down there. But of course, starving is not the only bad thing about not having enough food. A large percentage of people can be undernourished. And in developing countries, that's often the case. In fact, for most of history, the majority of people in underdeveloped countries were undernourished. And even as late as the 1960s and 70s, a third of the people living developed nations were undernourished. Today, that number is around 15%. And why is that? Because agricultural technology is just phenomenal and increasing. In the mid 19th century, it took 25 people a full day to harvest and thresh 1 ton of grain. Today, one person can do that in 6 minutes with a combine harvester, right? That's why famine is not disappeared, but largely disappearing, right? Wealth. People are more wealthy today. The wealth of human beings has skyrocketed in the last century. And all of these numbers, by the way, are already adjusted for inflation. So this isn't just some inflationary phenomenon. The average annual income of humans around the world used to be, measured in a few $100s. Today, it's over $10,000. The average income around the world, rich countries and poor countries combined. And the distribution of that wealth has also improved. Back in the 1800s and before, the majority of the world's population lived below what economists call the extreme poverty line. And these numbers are also adjusted for inflation, but about $2 a day is the extreme poverty line. That's barely subsistence living. But the majority of people in the world back before the 1900s lived below that extreme poverty level. Even in the 1970s, a majority of the world still live below the extreme poverty level, but you can see a growing bubble of people above that dollar amount. But fast forward to today, or even earlier in the 2000s, the majority of the world is above that level. All right. In fact, in 200 years, the rate of extreme poverty has dropped from 90% of the world's population to 10%. An amazing change. Now, you might be thinking, well, but the population has grown so much, there's still a lot more people in poverty. And I would have thought that too, but it's not true. Back in 1820, there were about 1 billion people on the planet, and 90% of them lived below that extreme poverty level. Today, there are over 7 billion people on the planet, but less than 1 billion of them are in extreme poverty. In fact, it's only about 500 million. Fewer people today live in extreme poverty with 7 billion people on the planet than did when there was only 1 billion people on the planet. Excuse me. All right. There's an economist whose last name is Gini or Guinea, who came up with an inequality index to measure the amount of inequality in wealth distribution in the world. And so this scale goes from 0 to 1. 0 means everybody in the world has the same amount of money. A 1 on the scale means one person has all the money and everybody else has nothing. So that's the entire scale. So, and for most of human history, we were near 0 because basically everybody had nothing. You had a donkey and a little garden, and that was it. But as industrialization started and wealth started to be created, of course, it was created in not everywhere in the world, but in a few places in the world. And so inequality started to grow. But by the middle of the 1960s or 1970s, that growing inequality changed globally and started to decline. And it's been declining for decades. Inequality declining, equality growing, the wealth distribution becoming more equal has been true for several decades now. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and some of that hits close to home. So in the United States and in England, that declining inequality or growing equality actually started a century earlier, back in the 1870s. And it, for about a century, it was declining. Inequality was declining. For the last 3 or 4 decades, inequality has been growing. So we have some work to do here. So it's not, everything is not rosy, but notice where this point is. Even today, even though inequality is getting worse, it's still better than it was since our country was founded, in 1776. So in this one measure, things are getting worse, but they're still better than they historically have been. All right, what do we spend our money on? Helping other people, right? Back at the turn of the last century, basically 0% of most countries' income was spent on social programs, welfare, essentially, giving money to other people who needed it. Back then, you basically had to rely on the church or begging or whatever, or you just did without. Today, most countries spend between 15 and 35% of their gross domestic product on social programs to help their fellow man. And those numbers, as you can see, continue to grow all the time. So we're getting more generous with our fellow man all the time. As a result, the poverty rate has been declining for decades, right? It used to be, when I was born, the poverty rate was around 30% in the United States. Today, it's less than 5%, right? Things are getting better. The environment, as you can see on this chart, gross domestic product, number of miles people drive, population, energy, all those things are growing. But pollution is declining, despite the fact that we're doing more of all the things that tend to make pollution. The absolute amount of pollution is declining. And that's mostly because of the Environmental Protection Agency and all of the, the 1970s legislation that we put in place to fix those kind of things. Even if you look at CO2 emissions, since the 1960s, CO2 emissions as a percentage of GDP has been declining in just about every country, actually for the last 4 decades, including in China. Now, this is per dollar of GDP. If you just look at in absolute terms, it's still true in just about every country except for China, where it's still growing. So we have some work to do, but things in general are moving in the right direction. All right, peace and war. This chart looks at, it breaks up time into 25-year increments and measures what percentage of each of those 25-year increments were the major powers in the world at war with each other. And for most of human history, it was most of the time, unfortunately. But you can see that today, it's almost zero. So we're becoming more peaceful as a species. In fact, if you look at the number of people who died as a result of wartime battles, you can see back in 1945 during the Second World War, of course, that number was very high, and there have been a couple of blips in it since then. But by and large, we're at a low point in human deaths due to war and killing each other over sanctioned battles. What about accidental deaths? We'll get to that next. Not wartime deaths, but murder, domestic homicide deaths have plummeted in most countries and has been for centuries, right? It used to be not that unusual to know somebody who was murdered. Today, most people don't know anybody who was murdered. Most people don't know anybody who was murdered. You know about people who are murdered because you see it on the news, but it really just doesn't happen that often for given historical standards. All right, what about accidental deaths? Automobile deaths have been declining since the day the automobile hasn't been invented, right? Since it was invented, and it has been declining ever since steadily. Okay, it's a lot safer to drive today than it was yesterday and yesterday and yesterday. The same thing, by the way, is true for plane crashes, pedestrians, even natural disasters. It's true for, not because we've tamed natural disasters, but because our medical science is so much better to treat people when they are hurt by natural disasters, and our preparedness for them and the structure of our buildings and things like that. We're better prepared to survive these kind of events. What about other kinds of safety things like people falling or death from fires or drowning accidents? Those things have been on the decline for years as well. Again, because of a lot of progress we've made in education and in preparedness. The one area that's gone up here, you'll see there, is poisoning. Does anybody want to wager a guess? Come off mute and tell me. I'll give you a few seconds to guess. Why might poisoning deaths have been skyrocketing, whereas almost all other forms of death have been declining? Anybody?
Just drug overdose?
It's easier to detect now?
No, I think it was Rob. I think I heard a drug overdose is the right answer. Drug overdoses are considered a poisoning death in the calculus that's behind this graph. So we clearly have a problem there. So that part is getting worse, but the rest of it is getting better. All right. Equal rights. This looks at web searches for racist, sexist, homophobic jokes, basically, right? Because literally, there was a time not too long ago where people would get on their, computer and search for racist jokes so they could tell them to the guys at the office on Monday, right? And I'm sure that still happens, but it happens so much less frequently today than it used to because it's just becoming socially unacceptable. In fact, if you look at the real tangible outcome of that, hate crimes, since the term hate crimes was invented and it was made illegal, the incidences of hate crimes has been declining, right? Especially for anti-Black hate crimes is basically half of what it used to be back in the 90s. Anti-Jewish hate crimes are down. Anti-white hate crimes, which turns out to be a thing, is down. Anti-Asian hate crimes are down. The only one that's up is anti-Islamic hate crimes, and that maybe is at least the incidents might be understandable given where you see the blips. It starts in 2001 with 9/11, and then each of the other blips are when there was a major Islamic terrorist incident, and that got people riled up. But other than that, we've made lots of progress in all of these areas. Unfortunately, this chart only goes to 2015, but you can see in general we've made lots of progress. What about rape and sexual assault? Also down across the board over the last several decades. Equal rights in terms of people's attitudes have improved significantly. This is a little bit hard to read, but it's called the Emancipative Values Index. It's an index created based on how people answer a bunch of survey questions about things like, do you support women's equality? Do you support free speech? Do you support gay rights? Do you support participatory democracy? Do you support protecting the environment, right? And it turns out just about everywhere in the world, people are becoming more and more in support of these things every year, a steady rise all over the world. In fact, the gains are so rapid that young Muslims in the Middle East, the world's most conservative culture, really, on many of these things, have values today that are comparable to those of young people in Western Europe, which is one of the most liberal cultures, in the 1960s. In other words, today's most conservative people were, in the 1960s, the most liberal people, right? So that's how rapid the progress is happening. All right, literacy. Back before 1970, literally less than half the population of the planet could read. Let me say that again. Before the 1970s, less than half of the world's population of human beings could read. Today, that number is over 80%, and in most developed nations, it's near 100%. All right, how is that divided by men versus women? Because that's been a huge problem and still is in many places. The female literacy to male literacy ratio, which would be 1.0 if women were as literate as men, and it has reached that in most developed countries, even in the most offending countries like Pakistan or Afghanistan have made significant progress in that area in women's literacy, allowing women to learn to read. And if you look at the world in total, that number is reaching parity between women and men on average around the entire planet. All right. Quality of life. The number of working hours that humans spend to earn a living used to be, back in the 1800s, 60 hours a week. That was normal. People worked 6 days a week. You rested on Sunday because that was the law, right? But you worked every other day of the week, and you worked about a 10-hour day. Today, it's about 40 hours a week. In Western Europe, it's about 35 hours a week, right? As a result, leisure time has grown significantly. We have more free time than we used to. Now, you'll notice one interesting thing on here is the gap between men and women having leisure time. There's a gap in there, and it's getting bigger. My presumption is that's because as more and more women enter the workplace, they tend to have work at work, full-time work outside the home, and then they still bear the majority of the work responsibilities inside the home. And so that's created a gap there that we need to fix. So guys, we need to step up and help close this gap at home. But notice that even women today who are working full-time jobs outside the home and an almost full-time job inside the home still have more leisure time today than their counterparts did in the 1960s, who mostly only had the inside the home job. So even though we've created an unfortunate gap, everybody has more leisure time than they used to. So that's a good thing, right? So given all of that, are we happier? Are we happier since all of these measures of human well-being are better? And the answer is no, we're not, because we keep upping our expectations about what it takes to be happy. But we should be happier. If we were just aware of or could remember how bad things used to be compared to today, which is part of what I'm trying to convince you of, we'd all be much happier if you really just realize by historical standards, things are so much better now and continue to get better. And by the way, the author of the book, his point is not, hey, everything's awesome, so we can stop trying. His point is, everything is awesome. It's getting more awesome. And the things that we're doing to make things improve will continue to work if we'll keep doing them to make things better in the future. So let's keep doing them. That'll probably be for another sermon. What are those things that we're doing to make things better? But they're getting better. And I want to close with a 2 or 3 minute video that the author, Steven Pinker, talks about in the book. He mentions as his way of summarizing in at least a little more memorable and humorous way, the situation that we're in, that everything is amazing now, but yet nobody is happier, is explained very well by a comedian. And he describes the comedian's 2 or 3 minute monologue that he gave that explains this. And the comedian he's talking about happens to be Louis C.K. And so for those of you that recognize that name, Louis C.K. Became persona non grata a couple of years ago for some of his behaviors off of the camera. Very understandably became persona non grata. So if, and I want to play this clip for you because it's mentioned in the book, and it's a large part of how he wants to conclude this part of the book. So I want to share it with you. But if you're at all bothered by seeing Louis C.K., you might want to check out for the next 2 or 3 minutes. But for the rest of you, I want you to watch this video and understand a little bit more about why we probably should be a little bit happier than we are. All right, so if you'll bear with me, I will try my best to show you this video.
When I read things like the foundations of capitalism are shattering, I'm like, maybe we need that. Maybe we need some time where we're walking around with a donkey with pots clanging on the sides.
You think that would just bring us back to reality?
Yeah, because everything is amazing right now, and nobody's happy. Because this is what people are like now. They got their phone, and they're like, it won't. Give it a second. It's going to space. Can you give it a second to get back from space? Is the speed of light too slow for you?
Yeah.
I was on an airplane, and there was internet, high-speed internet on the airplane. That's the newest thing that I know exists. And I'm sitting on the plane, and they go, open up your laptop. You can go on the internet. And it's fast, and I'm watching YouTube clips. I'm in an airplane. And then it breaks down. And they apologize, the internet's not working. The guy next to me goes, this is bull. Like how quickly the world owes him something he knew existed only 10 seconds ago.
Right.
And on planes, flying is the worst one because people come back from flights and they tell you their story. And it's like a horror story. They act like their flight was like a cattle car in the 40s in Germany. That's how bad they make it sound.
Right.
They're like, it was the worst day of my life. First of all, we didn't board for 20 minutes.
Right.
And then we get on the plane, and they made us sit there on the runway for 40 minutes. We had to sit there. Oh, really? What happened next? Did you fly through the air incredibly like a bird? Did you partake in the miracle of human flight, you non-contributing zero that you got to fly? You're flying! It's amazing. Everybody on every plane should just constantly be going, oh my God! Wow!
Yes.
You're flying. You're sitting in a chair in the sky.
Yes. Yeah. That's right.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Harmony UU podcast. Check us out online at harmonyuu.org for more details. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search Harmony UU. If you're in the Cincinnati area, please stop by one of our services on the first and third Sunday of each month at 10 a.m.